Hello and welcome to Module 6, Digital Images, Fonts, the RIP and PostScript lecture. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the types of digital images and fonts and what a RIP is. So, to get right to it, when we're working with graphic design, we have two main types of digital images. There's the vector graphics and the bitmap images. Bitmap images are also called raster images. So if you hear me say raster or bitmap, I'm talking about the same thing. Raster and bitmap images are what you usually work with photographs. So in Photoshop, those are generally bitmap images, which are essentially a grid of pixels. So it's the document is a grid of pixels, and each pixel is assigned a color, a lightness value, and a tone to it, and each pixel holds a certain amount of data. And so with the more pixels there are, the more data and the larger the file size is for a bitmap image. The other type of graphic is the vector graphics, and for those of you that love to work with Illustrator, that's generally what you're doing with Illustrator is you're creating vector graphics, and with that you're using the Bezier curve tool or the pen tool to draw lines. You have a fill and a stroke and so on. And the vector graphics are defined by mathematics, so they're mathematically calculated curves, lines, shapes, fills, etc. So it doesn't matter about the pixels, it just matters about what the line thickness is, where the line goes, what the fill color is, and so on. And it's all described in math, where bitmap raster images are described pixel by pixel. So to take a closer look at vector graphics, they're mainly used for illustrations and graphic designs and design elements. The pros for using these are that you can reduce or enlarge the image without a loss of resolution. When you're working with vector graphics, you don't have to worry about resolution because it's all mathematically defined. And so it gets scaled up mathematically, and it can keep the nice, crisp, sharp edges. And since it is math, it's just storing math formulas and numerical data for the file size, so the file sizes are generally smaller. You can have a giant billboard size graphic, 20 feet by 10 feet, and the file size could just be a couple of megabytes. On the other hand, the cons are that with vector graphics is they're not that great for photographic images, and they take a little bit more work to create versus taking a photo using photography. So there's a link down here that I have towards a wiki page, and if you go ahead and click on that link and you can say allow, you should be able to click on that link in your if you download the PDF from Canvas. And here it just describes what a Bezier curve is, and I link to it because if you scroll down, it shows an animation of what is happening with Bezier curves and how the math works. And so, I used to be good at some math, but when I start looking at this math, it makes my brain hurt. So I just kind of look at it and say, okay, I guess I could sit here and read it for a day and maybe understand some of it until I get farther down. Might need another day just for this part of the screen and so on to figure out what all that, it looks like foreign language there. But if you keep scrolling down, you get to these animations here. And when I see the animations, and maybe you will feel the same thing because we're visual type people, you kind of get a feel for like, oh, okay, so that's how the mathematics work when it is taking this point between these points on these lines. And you can imagine these being the handlebar curves of your pen tool as you're drawing with it. Anyhow, this is just an example of the Bezier curves and how they work. I'm going to close that now, and we'll go back to our presentation here. So vector graphics aren't great for photographic work, but it is possible. So here's an instance where this tomato is drawn through vector graphics, and you can see the amount of mesh networks and gradients and color and line and fill that would be involved to create this photographic quality image. So unless there's some shortcuts you could take, maybe wireframing and rendering or something like that, then it could speed it up. But if you wanted to take a photograph of a tomato dropping in water, you'd probably just take a photograph of it rather than do a vector drawing of it. Anyhow, the applications that use vector graphics are Illustrator, and then Freehand. Freehand was Illustrator. It was when it was owned by Macromedia. Macromedia also owned Dreamweaver, but Adobe bought Freehand. It was Illustrator's competitor, and they phased out Freehand, and Illustrator is now king of the or queen of the illustration graphic design world. Anyhow, Flash, when you're working in Flash, you're using vector graphics. If you've used Corel Draw, you're working with vector graphics there. The main file formats we use for vector graphics are EPS files, PDF files, Illustrator files, WMF, which I think are Windows Meta file, SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, and SWF are Shockwave Flash graphics. On the other hand, so the other type of graphic that we work with are bitmap images or raster images. And these are the pixels on a grid. Excuse me. So the benefits of using raster images is that you get photographic quality. You get photographs and the image editing capabilities that come with it. How you can do color correction and the masking and the blending into collages and the feathering and the drop shadows and that. Those are all raster effects. They have those effects in Illustrator. You can do drop shadows and you can do these painterly effects, and it's basically Illustrator applying raster effects to a vector graphic. So eventually it gets rendered out as a raster graphic, and we'll talk about that at the end of this slideshow. Some of the cons for using raster images are the enlarging the image will reduce the resolution and you'll lose image quality when it's enlarged. And just storing the files, you're working with much larger file sizes. When you have a large 300 ppi image, and it could be hundreds of megabytes in size, and it can slow your computer down while you're working on it. It can be slower to get through prepress too. Basically though, when you're working with raster or bitmap images, you are using these general color modes here. Line art, which is just black or white. That's typically called bitmap art, line art. Then there's grayscale. We've looked at that before, where there are actual gray pixels in here, everything from very dark or black to very dark gray to medium gray to light gray to white. The duotone, you could also put a tritone in there, and then the 4-color CMYK, which is your full color printing. So with raster graphics, resolution is the big factor. It's something to always pay attention to. You want to keep your line art, when you're working with the bitmap images, you want to keep that at a 600 ppi minimum. That gives you just crisper edges to your lines. And when you're doing grayscale, duotone, or color, our standard is 300 ppi. So file formats for raster and bitmap images include Photoshop file, PSD, Photoshop document, TIFF file. TIFF stands for tagged image file. There's actually 2 F's in it, TIFF, tagged image file format, but to reduce it to the 3-letter suffix is just TIFF. EPS, which is encapsulated postscript. PDF is portable document file. JPEG is Joint Photographers Group. If you ever wondered what that stands for, JPEG is a file format that is a raster format that photographers, when the internet was invented and photographers wanted to send their photos across the internet, they realized they were so large, and back then there was no broadband, or it was very rare to have broadband. It was all dial-up on phone lines. That the maximum speed was about 8K per second to go across the internet, and you have a 20 megabyte file, that'd take like 3 hours to send one photograph across the internet. So the photographers and the technologists came up with a file format that compresses the photographic image. So JPEG is the Joint Photographers Group. It's a compressed raster image format. So the key knowledge about using JPEGs is, yeah, they're great for going across the internet, but it compresses your image, and it is a lossy compression system. So when it gets compressed, it loses image data and thus image quality. Generally, the first compression or two doesn't affect the image quality too much, but when you open up JPEGs and you edit them and then you save them again as JPEG, and you open it and you save it and you resize it and you save it, and multiple edits and resaving of JPEGs, the quality of the JPEG can deteriorate rapidly and form JPEG artifacts that look pretty horrible. So it's not really preferred for using in print production because it's a lossy compression file format. So the standard for print is the TIFF file or the PSD. Those are your standards right there, or EPS, and PDF too, sorry. JPEG is not a standard for print, but it is a raster graphic. RAW is a newer file format that comes off of digital cameras, and it really just means RAW, as in that's the original image. So just a little bit about digital cameras. A digital camera has in it a CCD sensor, a light sensor that collects light. And for your basic cheap point and shoot cameras, what happens is that you take the picture and the camera collects the image, which would be a RAW image, but then your camera immediately converts it to a JPEG or maybe to a TIFF if you have that capability. And so in that conversion, it loses a lot of pixel data, loses a lot of stuff, but it instantly gives you a picture you can view on your little screen on your camera or download to your laptop. So if you buy a more professional single lens reflex camera, then you usually will have the capability of saving a RAW file and a JPEG file. And so when you take a photo, you'll get two files from the photo. One will be a .raw, and that has all of the image data that was collected on the CCD sensor. The JPEG file allows you to view it on your little screen there, but it has lost some of that image data. However, when you download your files to your computer, you will download the RAW file, and you can open RAW files through Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom, Aperture, those types of professional photo editing programs, and you can edit the RAW file before creating a TIFF or a PSD. And the benefit for that is that you can do color correction, you can do white balance with your RAW photo file, which is all of the image data that you collected in that photograph before you convert it. So you get higher quality images with better tonal range, better definition, and a wider range of color. However, different camera manufacturers have different settings for their RAW files, so it's not standardized. The next photo here, the DNG, is just like RAW, but it stands for digital negative, and it's an attempt to standardize RAW files between the different camera manufacturers such as Nikon, Olympus, and so on. So a DNG is a newer, RAW and DNG are newer file formats, DNG being even newer, and cameras are now saving to that file format also. These last few file formats are really old or meant for just the web. PICT is a raster file format for old Macintosh computers. GIF, it's pronounced GIF. If you go look online, the creator of the GIF said it is pronounced GIF, as in the peanut butter. Is for, oh goodness, I'm forgetting what it stands for. Graphic interchange file, I believe. And that's great for the web, very low file size, but limited color palette. Definitely not good for print production. Do not use GIFs in print production. PNG are great for the web. They hold transparency on your web designs, but they're not necessarily very good for print production. BMP is a Windows bitmap file, and a PCX is a Windows generated raster file. Anyways, I probably went way too long about the file formats, but I thought I should explain what JPEG is and what that means and why you should avoid using JPEG in your designs for print production. So generally, as I said, it's a grid of pixels. Here's an illustration of a grid of pixels, and if this were a picture of a person, you can see these pixels in this image are larger than these pixels here. And so the edge of this shape would be rougher edge than it would be here with the smaller pixels. So it's a visual representation showing that the more pixels you have, the finer edge and image quality you get. Here is a image that was shot at like 72 ppi, and then it's enlarged, and you can literally see the pixels going around their hair and their faces and so on. Okay, we're going to take a look at fonts. So I'm going to take a breath. And fonts. Now, fonts are one of the more common areas where there's problems. So choose them well and use them wisely. Things to know about fonts is that there's 3 general types, and they are designed for operating systems. So the Adobe Type 1 fonts are generally for Macintosh systems, Apple systems. The TrueType fonts are for Windows systems, and the more recent development are the OpenType fonts, which are cross-platform. Generally, we've moved away from these 2 font types here, and fonts are more open between the 2 operating systems than they were 10 years ago. So this is less of a concern, but it is still worthy for you to make sure you have quality fonts. One way to make sure that you have a quality font is that it will have 2 parts to it. It'll have a screen font, which is the bitmap version. So here on this right-hand side, there's a pixelated version, the pixel version of the font, and then a printer font, which is an outline, a vector version of the font. So they have the screen font for showing you that font on the screen. And the printer font is what gets sent to the commercial printer so that it can create those fonts as smoothly as possible when it goes through the rip. So there's ways to test fonts, whether they have the 2, the bitmap and the outline. And you can, if they don't embed into a PDF, that's a problem. Or if you cannot create an outline in Illustrator or InDesign, then that usually signifies a problem, and they're going to be a bad font. But we'll work on these during our tutorial. We're going to do a font exercise and talk about that. If you're paying for professional fonts, then you would want to read and make sure that you're getting your printer font and your screen font. Generally, though, if you're paying for them, they will have them. It's the free fonts that can get you in trouble. A couple of tips for fonts is to never rename the font file. They are named that way for a reason and for systems to recognize them, and it can mess up the applications that are using fonts if you've renamed them. You always want to include them with your layout. So if you're using InDesign, you want to make sure you package your design and have the font include font checkbox checked. If you are not using InDesign, if you're using Illustrator, you're going to need to collect for output or find the font and make sure you give the font to the printer. The best practice is to not use localized styling on fonts. So what that means is that if you're working in Microsoft Word and you type with Arial, and you can go up and you can select some type, and you can go up and you can click the B button to make it bold, or the I button to make it italic. That's localized styling. That's Microsoft Word making that font bold, making that font italic. Professional designers use typefaces that come with the font. So when you buy the font Arial, it'll come with a separate font file that is Arial bold, a separate font file that's Arial italic, a separate font file that's Arial bold italic, and so on. And so that's why when we use Illustrator and InDesign and Photoshop and these professional applications, that they don't have a bold button or a italic button. You go up and you have to select the Myriad Pro bold submenu and so on. So you want to not use localized styling. Just be cautious that type fonts, fonts with the same name can but be the different types of fonts. So a type 1 font versus a true type font with the same name, say Arial for both of those, may not be exactly the same font. There might be differences in things like the ligatures here. There might be differences in what sort of special characters are included. Some of the kerning might be different on some of the letters. So it's something to be aware of, and to make sure that you are using fonts that you're licensed to use. This typography here is just a review. It's not going to be on our tests or quizzes or exams. And below here we have there's some tips about using fonts in graphics. And so if you use serifed fonts, you're more likely to get misregistration errors than if you use sans serif fonts. So read that over and keep that in mind as you are designing with fonts. Okay, the RIP. The RIP does not mean rest in peace. It does not mean that. The RIP stands for Raster Image Processor. Oh, I got a typo there. Raster Image Processor. The RIP is a function of prepress, so it's not something that you do. It's something that prepress will do. And after you send your files to prepress, they flight check them, they check them all out, and they fix the errors, and then they impose them. They get them ready to go onto the printing plate, and then they'll go through the RIP. So the RIP does a few things. First, it takes all of your layers and all of your transparency and your drop shadows and all that stuff, and it flattens it down to one layer. And that's where errors can happen with when you have multiple masks and transparency effects and opacity and these effects all layered on top of each other. Sometimes weird things happen with computers, and things can happen. But anyways, it flattens your artwork down, and then it separates for color, for CMYK, for printing. So it makes this color separation. It's a very important part of the print production process, is that the RIP does your color separation. And it creates the halftone dots that will be on the printing plate that will go through the press to recreate your photographs. Excuse me. So it's a very important process. Everything that you give to prepress to go through press will go through the RIP, and the RIP is kind of like the judge of this is good, this is bad. This is going to be what you want, or it's not. And so it's where you find the unintended consequences. So if you recall in our tour of Liftx, when we were in the pre-press department and Scott was showing us the proof there, the color proof and the folded proof, that color proof is a proof of the ripped file of your art after it's gone through the rip. So that's when you're checking to see if drop shadows fall away, if weird shapes show up, if fonts disappear, and so on. So that color proof they show you from after pre-press is after your file has gone through the rip. And that's really the last time that it gets changed digitally, because that same file that makes the proof makes the plate. So the rip is very important. A little bit about PostScript. PostScript is a programming language that is used to describe the contents of a page. So I apologize for all the text on this page, but when you are making a PDF or an EPS file, you're using PostScript. And it's a computer language that describes everything. It describes your page size, where the first element is located, what the first element is made of. It's a one-point line that is blue, of this color, and so on. It describes every little thing. And from there, it creates the PDF file or the EPS file. EPS is encapsulated PostScript. It can combine vector and raster images together. Same with PDFs. PDFs are made from PostScript also. There was a program called Distiller that you used to have to make a PostScript file and then put it into Distiller to make a PDF. Now you can just make PDFs right out of Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, etc. PDFs and EPSs can be nested inside of each other, and so that's one thing to just, extensive nesting where you have a PDF inside of an EPS inside of another PDF inside of another PDF. Then it can get complicated and errors can happen when that happens. Excuse me. So just be aware of that. A couple of nesting is okay, but excessive nesting can cause problems. And the bit on PDFs here, we have different types of PDFs. So there's PDFs for archiving documents, which create very stable file formats. There's multimedia PDFs that can make slide presentations. You can include hyperlinks and video and audio in them. PDFs can be used to make forms, so you can fill out a form. Then there's what we're interested in are the graphic PDFs for print production, and that's the PDF-X version. PDFs are used for making CAD illustrations out of computer-aided design programs. It's an image format, so you can use it in InDesign and in Photoshop. It's used to make proofs and for digital publishing. Over on the side here, we've got some notes about PDF versions and Acrobat. It's not quite up to date, but as they create new versions, they keep adding more function to the PDFs. And so spot colors overprint were introduced into PDF version 1.3, forms were introduced into 1.4, and so on. When we're working with print production, we don't want transparency and layers and moving 3D graphics and forms in our PDFs. So the PDF-X will flatten it down to a 1.3 level. Over on the side here, you can read more about the PDF files. PDF X1A is the standard for print production. It's a very safe PDF file format, and we'll look at this in our in-class tutorials on PDFs. Basically, it takes away layers, it takes away interactivity, transparency, all that sort of stuff. What it doesn't catch, though, are image resolution, bleeds, and some of other things that would be caught in pre-flight. Anyways, that's just the beginning of PDFs. We'll talk more about it in our in-class tutorials. Thank you for bearing with me on this 20-minute lecture or so, and hopefully you can review it again if you missed anything. And I will see you in class.